first. My name's Jennifer Goldsack. I'm the Executive Director here at DiMe. And I'm thrilled to have you guys joining us for our first virtual journal club. We're taking a different slant perhaps on the traditional approach. We're going to be taking an Ask Me Anything approach to these sessions, where we really want our membership to interact closely with a variety of different experts. Month by month, we will have different experts coming in and talking to you guys about recent publications that they've put out into the published literature. So today, I'm delighted to welcome Andy Korovos, Dan Carlin, and Camille Nebeker, who are, in fact, my co-authors from the recent publication, Digital Medicine, A Primer on Measurement. I don't want to spend too much time with me twittering away. I want to hand over to our three hosts for the morning. Just quickly, in terms of approach, rather than burn time with introductions, while I think that's very important, what I would suggest instead is that as you ask questions of the authors this morning, that you simply just quickly introduce yourself and then pose your question, and we'll have some terrific discussion that way and get to know folks who have joined us this morning. So Andy, with that, I'll hand over to you.
Great. Hi, I'm Andy. I'm one of the authors of the primer. And I thought what we could start to do is tell you a little bit about how this primer came to be, and then walk through some of the components of it. So I'm actually I'm curious if this like raise hand thing works. So if you click on participants at the bottom, so there's a thing that says mute, start video, invite, and then participants. If you click on the participants at the bottom of that white thing, there's a little button that says raise hand. So using that, I'm curious how many people have read this or seen this beforehand. I'll raise my hand. Oh, and the people on the who dialed in, we won't be able to tell. Okay, so that's pretty much everyone. Okay, so I won't go too much into some of the detail, but effectively the backstory for this was kind of funky because a number of the authors were getting, I'm sure like you, were getting a series of kind of the same set of questions, like what's a digital biomarker? How's the FDA thinking about these tools? How do I know that the quality of the tool is good enough? So it originally started as a blog post where we said, what are the 10 most common questions around some of these digital products? And then how is digital medicine different from digital health and digital therapeutics? And so we started writing a blog. And actually, Jen, if you go back one more. Yeah. So we wrote this first blog post, and then we realized that there were way more than 10 questions that people had. And there were a couple areas of expertise that the original set of authors didn't have. And so we started pulling a couple different sets of authors. And eventually we realized that over time, like some of these primers can get pretty dry. So we were thinking about how to make this kind of interesting. And if anybody has read the Cartoon Guide to Physics, we said, well, is there any way we could make the Cartoon Guide to Digital Medicine? And so we hired the artists who did all the whiteboard animation videos that you might have seen on YouTube, and started to build this out. And then publishing this was actually also somewhat funky because a lot of these the primer is not really, it's not necessarily like a deep dive expert piece. It's an overview holistically. And so finding a publisher who wants to publish a primer, most say, okay, well, this is really important and necessary, but we really want to do expert specialty sessions. And so eventually we found a publisher who was both aligned with us on mission to not go way too deep on the expert and actually build out an overall primer piece. So before I jump into, I was going to walk through a little bit of how we thought about structuring the primer and some of the areas, and then open it up for questions. I want to kick it over to Dan and Camille, and Jen, if you want to chime in around your experiences with originally writing this piece and why you joined it, and why you decided to dedicate time to this project.
This is Jen. I'll start, never shy. I think that's a really good question, Andy. And my motivation was through previous interdisciplinary work, trying to think about how to use these different digital medicine tools, specifically in this one instance in clinical trials, though it applies really broadly also to digital medicine. It was really challenging to have conversations across different groups of experts. The classic example is I'd be talking with a group of clinical experts and we'd be talking about the process of validation. And then I'd have that same conversation with a room full of terrific experts in engineering, and they would have a very different definition for exactly the same term. And it gave me pause, and it made me realize that we're not going to advance the field unless we have a common baseline understanding. And to me, that was the most important thing to take away from the primer that we put together, was an accessible text where folks can come and do a really effective level set upon which to build the field.
Yep, I agree with that too. Dan?
That's a great answer, Jen. Andy, thank you. Hi, everybody. I think part of the motivation for me to be involved in this and to do this at the time we did it was that I had an increasingly large set of worries around someone else doing this and not doing it in a thoughtful way. You know, there are loud voices in this field, and there are voices that are driven by consumer tech, commercial interests. And I was worried that if we didn't start to put out definitional work in the field, that the field would be able to be defined by people who were not thinking about this as clearly as the co-authors on this paper, I think, have been. So for me, it was almost a protection of the field and making sure we got a thoughtful piece out there.
I think for me, this is Camille Nebaker. I come from a traditional academic research environment. I've been in academia my entire career, where things are very structured, as they are in the pharmaceutical industry with respect to ethics review and the processes for getting things into the workflows. And what I was seeing with this emerging landscape of digital tools that were being used both in the wellness area as well as in, targeting for the medical application, was just basically a wild west of sorts, that, the people that were making the tools didn't really understand that there were structures in place, and those structures didn't necessarily apply to this new ecosystem. And there are now some pretty significant gaps in where the guardrails, could exist. And I really wanted to be able to contribute to what people should be thinking about and what their responsibilities are as they are shaping this field. And so I was really, it was a pleasure to be involved in helping to contribute to the ethics and regulatory aspects. And, and that includes informed consent, ethics review, managing data, sharing data. And I think what I really would like to think strongly about as a group is, how do we really ensure that the people, the consumers, the patients, the participants are actually able to consent to participate in studies that are testing these products.
Agree. I think that was one of the things that, at least for us, I think a lot of people focus on, like, are these tools, are they valid? Are they usable? And for us, the two areas we really wanted to make sure that we hit on here are not just can we, but should we use some of these tools, and in what instances. So the ethics components were, I think, critically important in the era of digital medicine, which is effectively like, very high levels of surveillance for this to be possible. And then also around the cybersecurity side, which I think a lot of other groups haven't spent as much time thinking about. Jen, what I'm going
to add to that, Andy, sure. I just wanted to just chime in one more time. One of the things that I've observed of people that are doing job talks, and they're coming from computer science, they're coming from human-computer interaction fields, they think it's somebody else's responsibility, and sometimes they think it's a hybrid, that they should be thinking about ethics and privacy, data security. But in general, they're being trained to build things. They're not being trained to think about societal impact. And so I think we really need to think through as a community. We can't outsource this. We all have a responsibility. That's my take on it.
I definitely agree. Okay, so I'm going to do two things. I'm going to steal the sharing from Jen and walk you through some of the structure. And then generally what I find works best in these sorts of discussions, especially since there's a lot of us and you now have context, is we're going to do a very brief round robin, and I'll call on each of you for areas that you'd like for us to focus on. And then once we get a set of things that you're most interested in learning about, we'll spend most of our time there. So Jen, can I grab the screen share?
Absolutely. Let me stop sharing.
Okay.
All yours.
Great. Let's make sure I don't have anything embarrassing on my computer. Okay, so the primer actually one thing that would also be really helpful for everyone on the call to think about, one of the things that we're starting to work through is what are the areas where this could be the most helpful as we start distributing this farther out. So one place where it has been very common for us is there's a number of tech teams in larger, traditionally tech-only companies that are starting to do more work in healthcare. And so as they onboard their healthcare teams, this is a resource that they've been thinking about using for onboarding new teammates. And then similarly for more traditional pharma and device companies, as they have more digital roles, this is a piece that's at the intersection. So afterwards, actually, if you could shoot me a note and you have any groups, or if your group is interested in them, we're starting to print up physical copies of them so that you can actually have the book. And here in the beginning, we outline a couple of the main stakeholders that we had considered. And a lot of this really is around the intersection around technology and academic researchers and industry sponsors and clinicians and patients. We split it out into 3 sections. So the first chunk, which I suspect we'll spend more time today, is around defining digital medicine versus digital health. That's a good canned question if anyone wants to ask that one. And then second is a zoom out for newer readers around the different groups within and the centers within regulatory institutions like CDRH versus CDER at FDA, thinking about the different implications of using some of this connected technology in research versus care, and the implications as a product moves from research into care and goes to market. And then part 3 is a deep dive on certain areas like biomarkers versus clinical outcome assessments, verification and validation, and then other ways of considering trustworthiness of the tools, particularly around cybersecurity and some of the ethics components. So each of the sections has a series of these graphics. And now that I've gone through that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call on people. And then what I'd love to just hear from you is your name and then what you're most interested in for us to dive into. So David, you're first.
Oh boy, I'm up.
You're
Hi,
up.
yeah, I'm David Dansero. I'm a practicing physical therapist. I'm in a consulting role right now. I'm at PT Cumberland Wellness in Rhode Island, and I have become more interested in digital health, digital medicine, and the rehab side of things. Obviously, in terms of one of the main areas of interest I have is in terms of using sensor technology for engaging patients, remotely monitoring patients. So I think one of the questions I definitely had is, I feel like I'm sort of not in this alone as a PT, but a lot of PTs just don't even talk this language yet. And it's, now we have emergence of MIPS coming into practice, where we're starting to talk a little bit more about outcome measurements and engagement, but I'm intrigued by the potential for sensors and where they fit, but I'm working on a few projects now with a couple of industry partners that just getting the technology or the data to actually flow into the patient record and getting, different partners and platforms. The interconnectivity, I guess, is the big thing, and how, once we get that data, how do we all talk the same language? So like for example, one of the items mentioned was the importance, like that interests me, was talking about using sensors to ultimately predict falls, and using the walking algorithms and the more data that we get, I'm assuming they were referencing using AI to actually kind of smooth out and refine. But how do we get different technologies to all talk together? Maybe just to further this along and get that data to actually flow in a meaningful way into the patient's record.
Okay, good. All right, so we'll some of the areas focusing around helping create a similar ontology and taxonomy, and how do we share, like, help educate those around us and like share a common language, and then some of the outcome measures. Okay, and MIPS is great. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through, and then we'll kind of get a collective sense, and then we'll open this up and see where we should focus. So thank you, David.
Great.
All right, 619.
Andy,
yeah.
there's one thing that I might add there from David's point, which also has to do with when did data start to have information that's clinically meaningful. So it's partly about how do you get the data to flow, but it's partly about what data becomes meaningful and ought to be presented to, say, a clinician or a researcher, versus the more sort of sensor level data, which probably aren't particularly meaningful without a sense of analysis.
Spot on. Yep. Oh, Camille is 619. We're going to skip you. 773 is your area code, I think. Oh, wait, no, that's
Sean McConnell.
Okay, Sean.
Hi, I'm at the American Medical Association. Of course, we're really interested in the clinical validation part of it, finding what is the value for an app. Once it's through this pathway that you described, how do clinicians accurately assess what would be of most value to them and their practice? We're also very interested in the regulatory piece, how the FDA is stepping in and developing new pathways to regulate software. And of course, we're interested in the research side as well. So I think you've covered a lot of ground in this. It's very comprehensive and yet still deep in a lot of areas. So thank you for putting this out.
Great. Yeah. Okay. We can dive into all of those. We have a big regulatory section in there. All right, Brene.
Hi, I'm Brene Bent. I'm at Duke University in looking at digital biomarkers from wearable devices. And I'd like to echo David's comment on interconnectivity, because I think that's something that I'm really interested in, even taking it a step further with interoperability, looking at electronic health records and that integration with wearables data and other types of data that we might have in medicine. I'm also interested in the intersection between clinical research and industry, especially when you're talking about the validation and verification standpoint of that.
Yes, and if you're interested in that, what we can share, there's a DiMe working group that's diving in a lot more around verification and validation. It's still pretty unknown, but some of it is, so we can jump in there. Emery?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, this is Emery Siskin. I'm from Nationwide Children's Hospital at Columbus, Ohio. I am a scientist who has been working on the digital health domain almost 10 years. I really enjoyed your primer, and I especially enjoyed the part 2, which is about ethics regulations, which I have not been working a lot at the domain. What I've been doing is like creating solutions and just creating interventions on this digital platform. So for that reason, I have a question about ethics, especially because when we are increasing these artificial intelligence methods and algorithms to better understand the data, we are actually accessing more than we need, and how we need to regulate or control these tools is kind of like in the gray area. Like when we are doing the research, we are getting more than we need. So who should be the regulating, and eventually how we should interpret this or transfer this data to the provider to better help patients, because it's also a kind of like a black box, and that may need a little bit of training for the providers to better understand and to use the data. I would like to hear about the ethical part as well a bit more in this session, if it's possible. Thank
Great.
you.
Noted for Camille there. All right, Rick.
Yes, this is Rick Bartels. I'm in a consulting role, so I'm a principal in digital therapeutic commercialization consultants is the company. We work a lot with kind of bridging between developers, companies of digital therapeutic, digital medicine companies, and help them with their commercialization strategy. So a lot of my interest lies in the kind of what the payers would be looking for. So we also interact very closely with the payer organizations, and then their, obviously their interest is in the clinical data, and the efficacy of these products. Do they work with pharmaceuticals? Are they standalone? All the data as well, but also the HEOR, HEOR measures. That's a big interest on the payer side. And part of, a big part of commercialization. A lot of these have a lot of benefit, but it's like, well, how do they, where do they pay off? Are there downstream savings? We're preventing ER visits or other, other kinds of usage in the healthcare industry. So that's, broadly, that's the area that I'm most interested in, is like, how do we take this from, kind of a great technology, and then how do we commercialize it? How do we explain the benefit? Is it cost saving? Is it cost additive? Is it cost neutral? Does it replace pharmaceuticals? Does it work with it? What are the outcomes? So it's twofold: it's the clinical, but it's also the economic aspect of it. And I'm also very interested, as everybody has said, is like this common language. Even when we do a lot of advisory board meetings with payers, we get 10 payers into the room, medical directors, pharmacy directors, and the definition's all over the place. Is it digital medicine? Is it digital health? Is it digital therapeutics, et cetera? So that's a few things that I'm interested in.
Okay, great. I think generally, and we'll save a little bit of time at the end, we would love your thoughts too of how we can help create a common tone. I think writing something that, if people don't read it, or figuring out how to help create that common set of language. I mean, we're still learning and figuring out the best way to do that. So we'd love your advice on that too. Is there anyone else that we've missed? Okay, so given those, Dan, I think one of the areas that could be good to start is around some of the verification and validation, and maybe in moving from data to insights, and then afterwards diving more into some of the ethics pieces, and open up for questions, and then we can wrap with your feedback to us about like where we should take this going forward. So Dan, you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to, and I think that there's actually a really interesting interrelationship between the ideas of interconnected devices and how to think about interoperability, the processes of verification, validation, and ultimately the ethical question. And those things are directly related, right? Because at some level, interoperability depends on common meaning, and so. The way that you get to meaningfulness through any sort of a measurement device is through these processes that we sort of use as shorthand of verification, validation for, but really these represent sort of the crux of the entire problem, which is how do you translate a signal, and in the case of many of the things we're measuring in digital medicine, a behavioral signal, right, some sort of behavioral outflow, central nervous system outflow signal. And how do you turn that into something that has either meaning because it corresponds with another measure, another clinical phenomenon, or has meaning because it's able to predict a clinical phenomenon? And so to me, these questions can't really be separated all that cleanly. Of course, we need to categorize things. We need to think about types of validity, types of verification, just like we need to think of types of interoperability. But that ultimately these problems need to all be solved in lockstep. And it again ties into the ethical question, because when we think about the role that these measurements may have both in research and in clinical care, the ethics of their use are directly related to the meaningfulness that they provide. And so, you know, I guess what I'm, as an entree into the sort of the topic you've raised here, Andy, I'd say that the three things you've mentioned are in some way inseparable. And I don't know how that does as a starting point, but I'll let you jump back in.
I think let's open it up. So for everyone on the call, what are some areas where you'd like to dive in here? Or where are you like does anyone have an example of an area that you've been thinking about recently around, like, how do you know that the data are trustworthy and validated for your purpose?
Andy, this is Jen. I'll offer up a suggestion around the distinction between verification and validation that, you know, on teasing out these different concepts, I found very helpful, and I'm curious to hear if our colleagues on the line agree. I think, you know, a question right back when I started working on all these different sort of digital measures and engaging folks, different experts in the process, the question was, you know, is the technology validated? And to me, I think it's a very fair question. I'm not sure it's the right question. I think parsing out the process of developing some kind of digital measure or assessment into the different constituent parts of verification, where you actually look at the quality of the sensor and the raw data being captured, that analytic validation where you are absolutely certain that the number crunching, that processing that goes on, to take that sensor measure that Dan alluded to early on, I think in response to David's question, you know, can be quite challenging to interpret, making that valuable and understandable. And then the final piece, that clinical validation, to make sure it actually matters to your patients. I found that really helpful, and I'm curious because I think it means you go searching for the right answer from the right sorts of experts. And I'm curious to hear if our sort of colleagues on the line find that useful as a framework and whether that resonates or if they have questions.
I mean, Jen, I'm happy to jump in with just thoughts here that, you know, and you and I and all of us have discussed this at some length, but when someone asks, is this validated technology? Yeah, I think almost invariably you recognize that it's probably not a meaningful question, right? What does validation actually mean? And is it an event? Is anything ever really validated? You know, blood pressure is something we've been checking for a long time, and we have very high confidence that something like manual sphygmomanometry is giving you a valid signal, right? That at the time you measure the blood pressure with a sphygmomanometer in the office, you're getting the actual blood pressure, right? You're getting the number that corresponds to the person's blood pressure at that moment. But just over the last year, we discovered that if you send people home and have them check their blood pressure regularly at home, that the actual in-office blood pressure, while potentially valid for, say, emergency care purposes, isn't actually valid for the diagnosis of hypertension because it overrepresents a hypertensive population, right? It's more likely to find hypertension when checking in the office. So that even something as straightforward as blood pressure, which is sort of the first digital biomarker that became meaningful because of predictive validity, isn't fully valid, right? Because it has a measurement effect when checked in the office. So to me, that just sort of was a reminder of something that I've been saying for quite some time, that validation is a process that goes on from the creation of a measure and the entire life of the measure.
That's a great example. And for folks on the line, there's a terrific New England Journal piece from about 18 months ago, maybe, that shed some fantastic light on exactly that measurement, blood pressure.
One of the things back to the language point that I find is often in instances, particularly sponsors, and I think also in, this might be also applicable for you, David, and others who are doing in the clinical care side, when people ask, is the product validated. So, and as Jen mentioned, that is it applicable to this patient population? They just assume that the product has been verified, that it's actually measuring what you think it's been measuring. And for the most part, a lot of these digital tools haven't really even gotten to the verification part yet. And so I would definitely not, as you're going through, like not assume that verification is a done deal, that it's even measuring what it says it's measuring. Not even whether or not that measurement is meaningful for a certain population. So that's a helpful thing as you're going out, just like making sure you like really have a sense when someone says, oh, it's clinically validated, but like for what, and like what stages has it gone through?
Andy, maybe you can help with this. Are there reasons why it's not getting clinically validated, or are there gaps in the current structures that make it so that the partnerships with people like academics who can help with that are not part of the conversation?
No, I think in fact, many instances, people are going to do validations before they've even completed the verification. So even something like, say you're measuring somebody's heart rate, like your heart kind of like beat, it's not just like a single instance that your heart beats, like there's kind of a pre-beat and a post, there's like a flow to the beat. And so
right,
as a sensor is picking up that flow, depending on when it's sampled, because it has some sort of sampling rate, it might sample at different rates. And so by the time you even get to like, does this heart rate measurement mean something for this population when you're in like a clinic setting? I think one of the challenges is people jump towards the verification, and with software products, you're constantly shifting code and you can do updates all the time in a way that you can't with hardware. And so that just makes verification a lot more difficult, because if your software is continuously changing and your firmware possibly, and whatever algorithms you're using to like extract from the sensor, it's like going too fast to even like start working on validating it, because there's too much noise possibly, depending on how well they've gone. I mean, Dan, you spent a lot of time in this world too, and others, is what I'm saying, resonating with people or no?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely the case. The other thing that's interesting that we do run into in this space, which I think is the reality of much of healthcare, many of our medicines, we're not totally sure why they work the way they do, particularly in neuropsych. And so when we're talking about measuring behavioral outflow, particularly a little less on physiology, sometimes we sort of are able to get a signal that has a predictive value, and you don't even necessarily know why. And so there can be these cycles of meaningfulness that represent the intersection of this verification validation process. But yeah, when it comes to a physiological signal, particularly like pulse rate, or heart rate variability, or beat-to-beat variability, where there are very good gold standard measures of electrical, either electrocardiography or sort of established pulse cosmography. There it really is. Am I getting the same signal over time across a range of signals and across a range of patient characteristics that lead me to think that this new way of measuring the old thing is at least reasonably the same as the old way of measuring the old thing.
Okay, I would definitely agree with that, and that also takes a village to do, which is why this takes time. It is important. Emre, for some of the ethics components, what are some areas where we should do? What are some areas on your mind that we'll dive into?
Are you asking attendees or me?
Yeah.
I mean, I've been blown away by the number of
attendees. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I mean, so to kick this off, I had started some addiction clinics over the past 5 years or so, and the number of times I had otherwise very smart, reasonable people come in with some new technology and say, well, we just want to do user acceptance testing in your patients. We don't want to write a protocol to get IRB approvals. And I had to run them out of the office with pitchforks saying, well, you want to do user acceptance testing in a vulnerable patient population? That sounds like research. And so to me, there's this real tendency to think of this thing at the edge of traditional tech sort of A/B testing and clinical research, and folks who don't have clinical research backgrounds go into it thinking, oh, well, we can just sort of do UAT or A/B testing, when those of us who come from the patient protection world look at them and think, well, this is certainly unethical to be doing this in patient population. So there's an interesting intersection there that I think is not even close to being resolved at this stage.
It's an interesting intersection, but it's also incredibly dangerous. And if people like you aren't at the front end where you're interacting with the people that want to do this work, that have some semblance of knowledge regarding how things happen, then how does it happen? You know, and there's a lot of people that I think are working in the space that don't have that acculturation. And I mean, that's even happening with products that are getting deployed in our public health systems. The people that are working, you know, making decisions about what product is going to be deployed don't know what questions to ask. And I think that it's pretty terrifying from my perspective. And I'm really curious about how we might get in front of that. Does anybody have ideas on that? And I hear silence.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, you know, we've seen what happened with Theranos. Big promises, all this bling, a lot of investors. You know, it's not far away for the Theranos of behavioral medicine to happen. And it's, you know, we had UBiome recently, you know, getting a lot of attention about how, you know, there were some pretty shady practices going on. I think that we all in this community have a lot to risk, a lot to lose if we don't work together somehow. And I just don't know exactly how to herd the community. I think the DiMe Society is a huge step in that direction. I think we're trying to do something, you know, in terms of the ethical dimensions of it with our research center on optimal digital ethics out of UC San Diego. I think we're all just trying to get started in this space. And it's, you know, ideally communications is a good start, but how do you reach the people that don't know what they don't know?
Yeah, I think things like the primer is certainly aiming in the right direction. The other thing that I've started to do a lot more of is to reassure people that doing properly designed, ethically reviewed research isn't as hard as they might imagine. I think that this is one of the areas where academic IRBs in particular have done the entire research community a huge disservice by making approval such an onerous task, whereas some of the essential commercial IRBs really will hold people's hands as they walk through the process of developing and getting a protocol approved to make sure that the research is ethical, but also to facilitate the progress toward getting started. And so one opportunity I think that's out there is more sort of toolkits that enable somewhat novice researchers or people who are new to the biomedical field to sort of know what needs to, you know, really can walk in with a set of instructions to say, here's what you need to do, here's how to do it. It's not that hard.
Actually, one of the toolkits that could be useful, Camille, do you want to talk about the core toolkit that you have briefly? And then I think we'll probably have to start wrapping up the call shortly.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Andy. So about 5 years ago, I was working with behavioral scientists over at UC San Diego. I wanted to use wearable sensors to observe people, healthy people, children through, you know, it was 6-year-olds through 102. People that they recruited off Craigslist. They wanted to find out, could we observe natural behavior in the wild using wearable sensors? And at that point in time that they got started, these were research grade sensors that were created by Microsoft. One was a wearable camera that faced outwards. One was, you know, accelerometry in different parts of the body, wrist and hip form, and then GPS devices so that they could get a sense about where do people, you know, mostly these were physical activity researchers wanting to see how do people sit, stand, move throughout their space and time. And I've been a long-time IRB member, and they couldn't get approval, and they had 4 NIH grants waiting to get launched, and they couldn't get approval to do the observational studies that they wanted to do using these wearable sensors with consenting adults. And so I got involved as a consultant with them and realized, this is all new. This is, new kinds of tools, new kinds of data. Here's a group that's really wanting to do the right thing. The IRB really didn't understand the technology. They didn't understand the type of data being produced, the granularity, the volume. And so there was this huge immediate disconnect. No, you can't do it was coming from the IRB. And NIH is saying, this is really exciting health research. How do we advance it? And they're giving, obviously a lot of money toward that effort. And it was coming from the National Cancer Institute, National Institute on Drug and Alcohol Addiction. It was like they want to find out, how do we observe human behavior in real time? So I got involved with trying to figure out, how do we bridge that disconnect? And we got funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the UC San Diego system about creating a platform. And we did it through participatory design. We asked IRBs, what do you need help with? We asked researchers, what kind of problems are you experiencing? What can we do to help? And we created a platform that allowed them to share their protocols, to tag their protocols, so that others who were starting to go down this pathway could grab content that was already IRB approved, that described methods, described consent language. And then there's also a forum where people can ask and answer questions if they're getting started. And we were really working primarily with behavioral medicine, but also computer scientists, technologists. And now our community is around 750 people, with most people from the US, but also a pretty good showing from Australia and the United Kingdom, and growing in the UK. So anyway, we have a resource that we'd really like to keep working on. It's now part of our new research center for optimal digital ethics. It's one of our resources for disseminating and sharing practices that I think is a nice complement to the DiMe Society. But we know that there's a problem, and we want to help people work together to think through what are the ethical implications, and how do we prevent people from not knowing what they don't know, and creating a safe space where they can ask questions and not be berated for not knowing what they are just trying to learn. So that's kind of what we're focusing on with the Connected and Open Research Ethics Initiative. I can't believe I got through that without coughing. Sorry about my voice, everybody.
No worries. And if you all want to try or use this resource, it's online, so you can grab some of the snips, and Camille can give you the link for it. And it's also a link to the primer as well. Okay, Jen, I think you're going to wrap us.
I am, yes. So first of all, thank you to everyone who joined us today. This is our first foray into this DiMe Virtual Journal Club, so I appreciate you joining us. So a couple of things on that. First of all, we have another journal club scheduled for Tuesday, August 6th. Dr. Ray Dorsey from the University of Rochester will be joining us to discuss with folks his fantastic review of teleneurology and mobile technologies. It's really interesting. They look across a variety of different care settings and different modalities. It's an incredibly comprehensive review. So looking forward to that session. In terms of next steps from our conversation today, we will be posting this video and opening up a conversation in a new Slack channel in the DiMe workspace. All of you guys as DiMe members hopefully are enjoying the Slack workspace as a way to communicate with colleagues. And two additional requests, if we can. One, if you have questions we didn't answer this morning, please place them there. In addition, if you have suggestions for us as authors about how we can better get this primer into the hands of folks you think may benefit from it, any additional sort of distribution or dissemination channels, we welcome that. We do want to make sure as many people benefit from this information as possible. Also, if you have any feedback for us about how we can be better, how we can make the journal club more engaging for folks, anything that you would recommend after your experience this morning, we welcome feedback. One of our core values is obligation to dissent. So push back, help us grow, help us to make this as meaningful as we can for our members. So by all means, please feel free to shoot either Andy or myself a direct message through Slack if you have suggestions. So all that's left to say, Andy, Camille, Dan, thank you for leading this morning. Thank you all of you on the line for participating, joining the conversation, and look forward to continuing to work with you all as part of the DiMe community.